Have you ever sat down to work and within seconds felt your mind drifting away as if it had a will of its own, pulling you toward anything but the task in front of you, making you open one tab, then another, then check your phone, and before you realize it, an entire hour has disappeared while you've accomplished absolutely nothing? Why does that happen in such a consistent and frustrating way? And why is it that some people seem capable of locking into deep, uninterrupted focus for hours at a time, while others struggle to maintain concentration for even 5 minutes without feeling the urge to escape into distractions? Here's the truth that most people never fully understand, which is that focus is not actually about discipline or willpower in the way you've been led to believe, but rather about biology. And once you truly understand how your brain is wired to operate, you gain the ability to work with it instead of constantly fighting against it. Today, what you are about to discover is not just another productivity trick or some empty motivational advice that fades after a few hours, but a real, neuroscience-backed shortcut that allows you to access a level of focus that feels almost like a superpower, something so powerful that once you understand it, you won't be able to ignore it anymore. Let's begin with something that might feel uncomfortable at first, which is the realization that your brain does not actually want you to focus in the way modern life demands. And this isn't because something is wrong with you, but because your brain is functioning exactly as it was designed to over thousands of years of evolution. Your brain evolved to keep you alive in unpredictable environments, constantly scanning for novelty, danger, and anything new that might require immediate attention, which is why distractions feel so compelling and almost impossible to ignore in the moment. Every notification you hear, every scroll you make, and every random thought that pops into your head triggers a small release of dopamine. And what's important to understand is that dopamine is not about pleasure itself, but about anticipation, about your brain signaling that something might be important and worth checking right now. So when you try to focus on something that feels slow, repetitive, or mentally demanding, such as studying, working, or building something meaningful over time, your brain naturally resists, because compared to instant stimulation, deep work feels like deprivation. However, this is where things start to become interesting, because there exists a specific mental state where this resistance fades away almost completely, a state where focus feels natural, where time seems to disappear, and where your mind locks into a level of clarity and precision that feels almost effortless. You have experienced this state before, even if you didn't recognize it at the time, whether it was while playing a game, working on something you genuinely enjoy, or being completely absorbed in a moment where everything just seemed to click into place. This state is known as flow, and it has been studied extensively by neuroscientists, because in this state your brain begins to operate in a fundamentally different way, where your reaction time improves, your creativity increases, your memory sharpens, and distractions lose their power over you. The real question then is not whether this state exists, but how you can enter it consistently and intentionally, rather than waiting for it to happen by chance. And the answer lies in understanding that flow is not random, but triggered by specific conditions. The first of these triggers is clarity, because your brain has a natural resistance to ambiguity, and if you sit down with a vague intention like, I should probably work on something, you create confusion, and confusion immediately leads to avoidance. High performers don't rely on vague intentions, but instead define exactly what needs to be done in precise and actionable terms, replacing ideas like study more or work harder with clear objectives such as completing a specific task within a defined time frame. This level of clarity removes friction and allows your brain to shift from a state of hesitation into a state of execution, where energy is directed toward action rather than indecision. The second trigger is difficulty, but not in an extreme or overwhelming sense, because if something is too easy, your brain becomes bored, and if it is too difficult, your brain becomes stressed and disengaged. The optimal level of difficulty exists just beyond your current ability, creating a sense of tension that naturally pulls your attention inward, much like a well-designed game that keeps you engaged by challenging you, without making progress feel impossible. This balance is not accidental, but rooted in neuroscience, because your brain is wired to engage deeply with challenges that feel achievable, yet demanding enough to require full attention. Trigger is elimination, which is where most people fail, because they attempt to focus while surrounded by constant distractions, creating an environment where their brain is forced to continuously resist temptation. Trying to focus in a distracting environment is like trying to follow a strict diet while being surrounded by junk food, because eventually, your brain will give in to the easiest and most stimulating option available. Real focus requires removing those options entirely, which means placing your phone out of reach, turning off notifications, and creating an environment that supports concentration rather than undermines it. Focus is not about constantly resisting distraction, but about designing your environment in a way that reduces the need for resistance altogether, making it easier for your brain to lock into a single task. Now, there is an even deeper layer to this process, something that acts as a hidden switch in your brain, and when activated, it makes focus feel almost automatic, and that mechanism is known as the dopamine reset. As mentioned earlier, your brain is constantly seeking stimulation, and the more high-intensity stimulation you consume through social media, fast-paced content, and constant digital input, the harder it becomes to engage with slower, more meaningful tasks. When your brain becomes overloaded with stimulation, anything that doesn't provide immediate gratification feels dull, making it increasingly difficult to focus on work that requires patience and sustained attention. The solution is not to force yourself harder, but to temporarily reduce the amount of stimulation you consume, even for a short period, by removing sources of constant input and allowing your mind to settle. At first, this can feel uncomfortable, because your brain is used to being constantly entertained, but if you stay with that discomfort, something begins to shift as your baseline level of stimulation resets. As this reset occurs, tasks that once felt boring begin to feel more engaging, and focus becomes easier, not because you are forcing it, but because your brain is no longer overstimulated. When you combine all of these elements, including clarity, balanced difficulty, elimination of distractions, and dopamine regulation, you create the conditions necessary to enter a state of deep focus. In this state, time seems to compress, effort feels minimal, and you stop thinking about focusing because your mind is fully immersed in the task itself. But a system that is used consistently by high performers across different fields, including athletes, entrepreneurs, writers, and creators who produce work at an extraordinary level. These individuals do not rely on motivation, because motivation is unpredictable and inconsistent, but instead rely on structure, which creates stability and repeatability in their performance. Instead of asking how they feel in a given moment, they focus on the systems they have built, and it is this shift from emotion to structure that separates those who struggle from those who excel. There is also a deeper psychological component to consider, which is your identity, because the way you see yourself directly influences how you behave and how your brain interprets challenges. If you believe that you are someone who struggles to focus, your brain will look for evidence to confirm that belief, reinforcing patterns of distraction and inconsistency. However, if you begin to shift that identity, even slightly, by seeing yourself as someone who is learning to control attention, you create a new framework that allows for growth and improvement. This shift may seem small, but it has a powerful impact, because your brain naturally seeks consistency between your beliefs and your actions, gradually aligning your behavior with your identity. Another critical concept to understand is the illusion of multitasking, because what most people believe to be multitasking is actually rapid switching between tasks, and each switch comes with a cognitive cost. This constant switching reduces focus, increases mistakes, and creates a sense of productivity that is ultimately misleading, because true focus requires sustained attention on a single objective. By training your brain to focus on one task at a time, even for short periods, you begin to build your capacity for deep work, gradually extending the duration of your concentration. This process does not happen instantly, but through consistent practice, where 5 minutes of focus becomes 10, 10 becomes 30, and eventually you are able to sustain attention for extended periods. Your environment also plays a significant role in shaping your ability to focus, because external conditions influence internal states more than most people realize. A cluttered and chaotic environment leads to scattered thinking, while a structured and intentional space supports clarity and concentration. This does not require perfection, but alignment, where your environment reflects your intention to focus and create without unnecessary distractions. It is essential to understand that focus is deeply connected to your physical state, because your brain is part of your body, and its performance depends on factors such as sleep, hydration, nutrition, and movement. Ignoring these factors makes focus more difficult, while supporting them creates the conditions for optimal mental performance. When you begin to apply all of these principles together, you create a system that allows you to access deep focus more consistently, transforming the way you work and think. Imagine starting your day without immediately flooding your brain with distractions, defining your goals with clarity, removing obstacles, and entering a state of concentration that feels natural and sustainable. This is not something reserved for a select few, but a skill that can be developed and refined over time through intentional practice and understanding. The real question is not whether this is possible, but whether you are willing to change your approach and move away from relying on motivation toward building systems that support your focus. If you continue to chase distractions and rely on inconsistent bursts of motivation, you will likely remain stuck in a cycle of starting and stopping without making meaningful progress. However, if you begin to apply these principles, even imperfectly, you will gradually build momentum, strengthening your ability to focus and increasing your output over time. This shift transforms not only your productivity, but your identity as you move from someone who struggles with focus to someone who operates with clarity and precision. The shortcut, then, is not about avoiding effort, but about understanding how to direct it effectively, working with your brain rather than against it. And once you learn to do that, you gain an advantage that most people never develop, because they remain trapped in patterns of distraction and inconsistency. So the next time you sit down to work, instead of relying on willpower, focus on creating the conditions that naturally lead to deep concentration. Trigger the state, trust the process, and allow your brain to operate at the level it was always capable of reaching, unlocking a depth of focus that changes everything.